Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is The Blair Witch Project. Now, The Blair Witch Project came out in the summer of 1999, and the film was made for an extremely low budget, but when this movie came out, it was a huge success, and I think at the time, I could be wrong on this, but I believe at the time this movie came out, this was the highest grossing independent film since John Carpenter's Halloween. Now, this film was a pretty big deal when it came out back in 1999. Now, I was 6 going on 7 at the time this movie came out, and I didn't see the film till years later, but when this movie came out, I remember, my teachers talking about it. This was probably the most talked about movie back in 1999. This is also the movie which really did make found footage films a thing. Now, this was not the first found footage movie, but this is definitely the movie which pushed this genre into the mainstream. Even though at the time this movie came out, I wouldn't necessarily call found footage a genre. At the time this came out, it was more of a gimmick. Now, once again, this was not the first movie to use that gimmick, but if it wasn't for this movie, we probably wouldn't have a lot of the found footage films we have today. Now, despite how successful this film was when it came out, it was also a very polarizing film at the time. People either loved this movie or absolutely despised this film, and it's honestly still kind of like that today. Even today, this is a very polarizing film. You either love it or hate it, and I've seen very little in between. Now, while this film still has its fan base, I actually think the film has become kind of underrated now, because now it's become kind of the cool thing to hate on this movie. So many people say, oh, the movie doesn't hold up as well as it used to, and so many people say, oh, it doesn't hold up as well with second viewings. I know a lot of people who say they liked this movie when they first saw it, but every time they see it again, they don't like something about it or something. So many people say it doesn't hold up or it's not that good. And I couldn't disagree with that more. I still love this movie, and I honestly think this film is creepy as all fuck. Seriously, this film, to me, is one of the creepiest and one of the most genuinely terrifying films I have ever seen. To me, this film is just as scary now as it was when I first watched this movie. If anything, this film gets better with second viewings. Now, if you don't like the movie, that's cool. I mean, to each his own, but I personally love this movie. Now, the film is directed by Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez, and they were inspired by a lot of these paranormal documentaries you would see about things like hauntings and ghosts and UFOs and alien abductions and Bigfoot, and they really felt like a lot of these paranormal documentaries a lot of the times were more horrifying and more creepy than anything you would see in a horror film. So they wanted to make a horror film that kind of has the sensibilities of a lot of these paranormal documentaries. Now, Myrick and Sanchez were primarily inspired by the 70s documentary series In Search Of, which was hosted by Leonard. And basically what they wanted to do with this movie was they wanted to make a film about a group of people making a paranormal documentary, but then they actually get caught up in the paranormal phenomenon that they're making a documentary of. And essentially they wanted to make a film that combines the sensibilities of both a paranormal documentary and a horror film. Now, Heather Donahue, Joshua Leonard, and Michael Williams were the three actors who were cast to play the three main characters of the film, and the three main characters of the film are really just fictionalized versions of the three actors in the film. Essentially, the three characters are named after the three actors to give the film this level of reality. Now, this is also the first movie to use viral marketing. Now, at the time this movie came out, the internet was a relatively new thing. Like, the internet was not really a part of people's lives like it is now. Like, in 1999 and even into the early 2000s, not everybody had a computer in their house, and not everybody was using the internet the way people are using the internet today. So this was really the first movie that really utilized the internet. Like, the filmmakers actually created a website for this movie that promoted the film as being real. Like, they tried to make it look like this was actual footage that somebody found out in the woods and then somehow were able to distribute it in theaters. Like, that's kind of how the marketing was for this movie, and a lot of people bought it too. They even put up missing persons posters of Heather, Mike, and Josh around film festivals to, once again, create this illusion that the movie was real. There was even a fake documentary called The Curse of the Blair Witch, which aired on the Sci-Fi Channel, which once again was creating this illusion that the film was real. And once again, a lot of people bought it. Like, a lot of people at the time this movie came out legitimately thought it was real. Of course, we all know now that it wasn't real, but regardless of what you think of this movie, you can't deny, though, that the marketing campaign for this film was actually kind of brilliant. Now, the plot of the Blair Witch Project is, it's about these three student filmmakers named Heather, Mike, and Josh, who in 1994 went out to the woods by Burkittsville, Maryland, to make a documentary about something called the Blair Witch, but they ended up disappearing, and a year later their footage was found. And essentially the whole movie is supposed to be the footage that they shot out in these woods that somebody found in the woods and then edited together, and once again, it's creating this whole illusion that it was real. So, the movie begins where they're making this documentary about this legend called the Blair Witch. Now, in the movie you find out that the town of Burkittsville used to be known as Blair, and according to the legend, in the 18th century there was a woman named Ellie Kedward who was accused of witchcraft by the people of the town of Blair, and she was essentially executed by being sent out into the woods where she died of exposure, and according to the legend, the spirit of Ellie Kedward haunts the woods by the town of Burkittsville. And in the movie you find out that over the years, the town of Burkittsville has been plagued by disappearances and bizarre murders, including the murders committed by a man named Rustin Parr, who murdered these 7 children back in the 1940s. Now, in the movie, Heather, Mike, and Josh, they don't really believe the legend of the Blair Witch, but they still want to make this documentary about the legend, and what happens in the movie is they go out to the woods to shoot more footage for the documentary, but as they're camping out in the woods, they start to hear weird things, and eventually they become lost in the woods, and they can't find their way out, and soon it becomes apparent that somebody or something is stalking them. And that's the basic plotline of the Blair Witch Project. Now, the 3 main characters of the film are Heather Donahue, Joshua Leonard, and Michael Williams, and once again, these 3 characters, they're named after the actors who are playing them. Essentially, the actors in the movie are playing fictionalized versions of themselves, once again, creating this illusion of reality. And I have to say that the acting in the movie is phenomenal, and one of the things that makes the acting so good in this movie is the fact that it doesn't feel like acting. It feels like these are real people out in the woods who are genuinely scared and are genuinely being hunted by somebody or something. And I've heard a lot of people say that they thought the acting in this movie sucks, and I have no idea what the fuck they're talking about, because, once again, it doesn't feel like acting, it feels real. Like, that's the thing about this movie. Of course we know it wasn't real, but it feels real, and the fact that so many people at the time this movie came out legitimately thought this was real is just a testament to how good the acting actually is. Now, the opening text of this movie says that they disappeared, so you know that something bad eventually is going to happen to all three of these characters, and that just creates such a feeling of dread and hopelessness throughout the whole film, because you know that they're all eventually going to meet a grim fate. And what makes it even more horrifying is you genuinely like and care about these characters, or at least I did. Like, I loved the three characters in this movie, and I genuinely empathized with them. Now, I loved the character of Heather Donahue in this movie. Like, a lot of people said that they thought her character was a bitch, and I couldn't disagree with that more. I genuinely liked her character, and here's the thing, she's directing a documentary. When you're directing something, sometimes you have to be a little uptight in order to get what you want, and also, if you end up in the same situation that Heather ends up in this movie, I'm pretty sure you would be a bitch too. So I hate when people say that the character of Heather was unlikable or she was a bitch. Like, once again, I couldn't disagree with that more. Yes, there were times where she could be, to contradict myself, yes, there were times in the movie where she was a little bitchy, but you know what? I completely understood why she was a little bitchy. Once again, if I was in the situation she was in this movie, I'm pretty sure I would be a bitch too. And I also really liked the characters of Mike and Josh in this movie. They were also very likable characters, and it's really heartbreaking in the movie because in the beginning, you see that these three characters are genuinely friends with each other, but when they get lost in this woods and when they realize that something is after them, you see them all start to turn on each other, and honestly, there were points in this movie where I really do feel like both Mike and Josh were being extremely mean to Heather. I mean, granted, there were points where Heather was really mean to them. Once again, they're all mean to each other, and they all start to turn on each other because they realize that they're lost, and they realize that something is after them, and it's really heartbreaking to see. And there are so many scenes in this film which are so genuinely creepy. Like, there's a scene in the movie where Heather, Mike, and Josh are in their tent, and at this point in the movie, they already realize that something is after them, but they're in their tent, and all of a sudden they hear what sounds like little kids outside their tent, and I think at one point you even hear a baby crying, and basically you're supposed to assume that these are the ghost of the children who disappeared in the town, or maybe even the ghost of the children that Rustin Parr murdered, and all of a sudden there's banging on the tent, and they run out of the tent, and it's such a creepy and haunting scene. And in that same scene, after they run out of the tent, there's a point where you see Heather turn to look at something, and she starts screaming, "Oh my god, what the fuck is that?" And you know she's seeing something, but you as the audience member, you don't see what she sees, and to me that's so freaking horrifying, because what I create in my head, what I'm imagining Heather is seeing in that scene, is far more terrifying than anything they could have shown you in the film. There's also the iconic scene in this movie where Heather is in front of a camera and she pretty much knows that her and her friends are never going to get out of this woods, and she's in front of the camera basically apologizing to Mike and Josh's parents, like in case this footage ever gets found, and she feels like it's her fault that they're out there, and the feeling of hopelessness and dread that you feel from that scene is overwhelming, and it's a scene that's both terrifying, but really heartbreaking as well. Now, another thing I love about this movie really is just the ambiguous nature of the film. For one, you never actually see the witch, and because you never see the witch, there's a lot of stuff in this film that really is kind of left open to the viewer's interpretation. As I said, because you never see the witch, what you imagine in your head is far more horrifying than anything they could have shown you in the movie. And another interesting thing about this movie is, because you don't see the witch, and because there's so much in this movie that is left to the viewer's interpretation, you could make the interpretation that maybe what's happening to these characters is not supernatural at all. Like, you could assume that yes, maybe it is supernatural, like maybe these woods actually are being haunted by the ghost of Ellie Ketward. At the same time, maybe these three main characters are just being pursued by a bunch of maniacs who are using the Blair Witch legend as a way to fuck with them. Like, even the scene where they're in their tent and they hear those little kids outside the tent, you could assume that maybe this is just a family of psychopaths, kind of like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre kind of scenario, and maybe those are the children in the family. Once again, you really don't know if what's happening to them is actually supernatural or not, and that's what's so great about the movie, is there's so much in this film that is left open to the viewer's interpretation. Now, I actually think the film is kind of a commentary on the ways in which technology and the media have affected us not just as a society, but as individuals as well, and the ways in which technology has affected the ways we communicate with each other and the ways we get our stories out there. Like, you have the scene in the movie where Josh is pointing the camera at Heather and saying, "I think I know why you like this camera so much. It's not quite reality." And he starts talking about how it's a filtered reality, and once again, the whole movie is done from the point of view of these cameras, so everything you're seeing is what the cameras saw, so you have no idea what happened to these characters when the cameras weren't rolling. So it's this whole idea that even the reality of the film is a filtered reality. It's not quite reality, but it's a filtered reality, and it's this whole idea that we almost create our own reality through the media, and it's a filtered reality. And even in the movie, you get this whole idea that this technology, this media, is the only way these characters are going to be able to tell their story, because Heather pretty much realizes almost early on that, yeah, they're never gonna get out of this woods, and these cameras and this film equipment is the only way that people outside of the woods are ever going to find out what actually happened to them. And there's the point in the movie where, I think it was Josh who is yelling at her saying, "Why do you keep recording this?" And Heather's like, "It's all I have left." And once again, you realize that, yeah, this is all they have left. This is all they have left to tell people what happened to them, to tell their stories. So they're almost dependent on this technology to get their stories out there. Now, I also think the Blair Witch Project is one of the few truly effective found footage films. Now, the Blair Witch Project is of course not the first found footage film. A lot of people say the first found footage film is actually 1980's Cannibal Holocaust, even though only parts of that movie are actually done in the found footage style. But if you watch Cannibal Holocaust, you could definitely see the blueprints for this movie. There were even scenes in this movie that actually reminded me of scenes from Cannibal Holocaust, so there's no doubt in my mind that Myrick and Sanchez might have taken a lot of inspiration from Cannibal Holocaust for this movie. But even before Cannibal Holocaust, there was a 1976 film called The Legend of Bigfoot, which was done very much in that, like, mockumentary style, even though the guy who directed that movie, I think, was actually claiming that it was a legit documentary, and before that, there was the film The Legend of Boggy Creek, which I'm embarrassed to admit I actually have not yet seen that movie, but apparently that movie is also done in kind of a mockumentary style as well. And even at the time this movie came out, there was a film called The Last Broadcast, which came out around the same time as this, and that was also done in the found footage style as well. So, the point I'm trying to make is even at the time this movie came out, found footage was not a new thing. However, at this time, found footage really wasn't a genre, I would say. It was really more of a gimmick that this movie and a few movies before it used. Now, in the years following this movie, you would get a few other found footage films here and there. Like, in 2005, there was a Japanese film called The Curse, which is actually a really freaking creepy movie. Not as creepy as this movie, but I would definitely say that, next to this movie, is one of the few truly effective found footage films. And then in 2007 and 2008, you got films like Paranormal Activity and Cloverfield, which I think are the movies that truly cemented found footage as a genre. And because of those movies, now you have a found footage horror film coming out almost every year now. And you also have movies that aren't horror films that use the found footage gimmick. Like, a few years ago, you had the movie Project X, which was a found footage film, but it was a comedy, not a horror film. You also had the movie Chronicle, which had horror elements, but I would say Chronicle was much more of a really unique take on the superhero genre. And just this year you had the film Hardcore Henry, which I don't know if you would really call that a found footage film. In a way, I actually do consider it to be a found footage film because the main character of that movie was a robot and his eyes were technically cameras, so in a way you could call Hardcore Henry a found footage film. But I really do think a lot of these found footage films that we're getting today really do owe their success to the Blair Witch Project, even though the Blair Witch Project wasn't really the first found footage film. Now, somewhat similar to what I did with my Jaws review, I had a bunch of friends of mine record their own short reviews on this movie so I could put them together and show them at the end of this video. So, if you made it through this video, here are a bunch of short reviews that my friends did on this film.
Hi guys, my friend Christian has asked me to do a brief review on the movie The Blair Witch Project, which I'm more than happy to do because it is one of my all-time favorite horror movies. It's kind of interesting. I don't feel like you're going to find a lot of people who say that anymore. When it was released back in '99, I believe, it was hugely popular, but a backlash quickly set in, and now I feel like most horror fans, maybe not most, but a lot of horror fans no longer speak of it in positive terms. They say it's boring. They say it's tedious. They say it's annoying. I am not one of them. I still really love this film. I watch it every October. It's become part of the tradition along with some of the Halloween films and Trick or Treat. And I just love the film. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I love the film. One, there's a lot of found footage films, and I'm actually a fan of the found footage genre when it's done right. And it's never been done better, as far as I'm concerned, than the Blair Witch Project. And part of that is how it was filmed. The fact that there wasn't actually a camera crew, the actors weren't going to some posh hotel at night. The three actors were actually camping out in the woods, filming the footage themselves, making up a lot of their own dialogue, and sort of finding their characters in the moment. When it was cold outside, the actors were cold. They weren't starving, but they were hungry. When it rained, they were wet. All of this lends the movie a great sense of authenticity that I don't think you get in some other found footage films that are a little more constructed. And I think the three actors actually did a wonderful job of creating characters that felt real. And a lot of people will complain and say, Heather is unlikable. Heather is unlikable in certain ways, in very realistic ways. She came across as a very real person, and as the movie went along, I did find myself empathizing with her. Because you don't have to be a 100% likable person to engender empathy. And I think the film also, it understood that sometimes what's the scariest thing is what is implied, what is unknown. A horror film doesn't have to have over-the-top special effects or over-the-top gore. Now, I'm not against those things per se, as long as they serve the story and aren't standing in the place of a story. Here, you don't need that stuff. The suspense that is built gradually really affects the audience, and the fact that you never actually see what's after them, even at the end, I think is brilliant, because I have long since held the belief that ambiguity and subtlety can be very effective in horror, and they are not utilized enough in modern horror, I think. So I really think the Blair Witch Project is going to go down as one of the classics of horror cinema, for all the reasons that I have stated before. And the film, I find, is as effective today as it was the first time I saw it in the theater when it was initially released. I can't say enough about the film. I really think the filmmakers, the actors, everyone involved really understood suspense. They understood tension. They understood authenticity. And they created a truly classic film.
Hey guys, it's Christian Feliciano here. I'm a friend of Christian's, obviously, and he asked me to help him do this review and to give you my thoughts on the Blair Witch Project. Now, of course, I don't have to go into the plot because you guys have already probably heard it from him, and of course, you've probably seen the movie, so hey. But, my thoughts on the film, I love it. I actually do. I watched it recently again after years of not watching it and pretty much forgetting a lot of it. And I still really do enjoy it. I think it's a really good film. There are things in it that kind of, now that I've seen it years later, after the hype has died down, I feel like, could be improved upon. I wish it was a little better, mostly because it follows some of the horror cliches that kind of bother me in other films. For example, the idea of hating the characters in the film. Now, yeah, they're good kids and all that when it begins, and you like them and all that stuff. But then, of course, as it goes on, they start going crazier and they start turning on each other, and yeah, you get what I'm trying to say. And that always, for me, bothers me in a lot of horror films. But the difference between this one, or what makes it worse in this one for me, a little bit more than any other horror film that happens, is that in this one you don't get to see the creature. You never get to meet the creature, and you never get to, there's just nothing. It's just not there. Spoiler alert: you don't actually see it. So the fact that you don't see it bothers me because you don't have anything to root for against the kids. Now, I'm not saying that I want to see kids die, but when they turn out to be annoying freaking teenagers, like in a lot of slasher films, like the Jason films, the Freddy films, things like that, you want to see the killer succeed. You want to see him, how creative he's going to get with his murders and all that stuff. But in this movie, because you don't see the creature, you don't really have anything to, go at. You don't really have anything to pretty much root for. Then you don't like the kids at some point and all that stuff. The movie's still interesting. It sounds like I'm bashing it, but it's a great film. I love it. It's just that for me, years after the fact that we don't believe it's real anymore and all that stuff, it does kind of bother me, and I noticed that as I was watching it. But overall, I think it's a great film. I think it was put together nicely. I think it is pretty creepy in a lot of parts, especially certain scenes where you don't really know what's going on. It's hard to explain unless you really go into pure detail. But for an example, I'll give you a scene. There's a scene where they're in a tent, and you see children's hands hitting the tent, and you don't see the children, but you hear it and you see it going on, and it's scary as hell. That is a very scary scene, and then of course the ending is very, very. I mean, it's a shocking ending, but and then overall, it's a good film. It's acted well and all that stuff, shot well. Yeah, it's found footage, and I know it's a little annoying, but it's good. It's one of the good found footage films out there. It's one of the only good ones out there, and I really, really enjoy it. I really do. So overall, a great film. Don't really know what I would rate it. I definitely, it's not one of my top 10. It's probably not even one of my top 50 films, but I do enjoy it a lot. It is a great film. And I definitely recommend, if you haven't seen it, I would say definitely see it. Thank you, Christian, for allowing me to be a part of this review, and thank you guys for watching.
Well, I remember actually when Blair Witch actually was released. The campaign, the advertising campaign, was very interesting. I think it was the first instance of viral campaigning where they really just put up posters and just had the symbol on it, and they put out, I think, a website or something, right, and wanted posters, and they put a documentary on TV, right, The Curse of the Blair Witch Project. So it was interesting that they were trying to sort of give us this sort of this idea that it was real event, that it was real people, that these events actually occurred, and that this was actual footage of these people in their quest to find the Blair Witch. So it was interesting that they really tried to keep that that illusion up, and people bought it. I mean, at the time, people were angry that how dare they release this footage of these people that were missing. So people really bought it. I mean, it was a huge phenomenon at the time. And in the 90s, you didn't have too many horror phenomenons. So I think the Blair Witch Project probably was the biggest horror phenomenon of the 90s. And I love the film. I thought it was great. I'm a huge fan of witchcraft movies and sort of rural horror movies. So I thought it was great. I remember going to see it and being very impressed with it, being very impressed with the filmmaking, being very impressed with the camera work. It did remind me of other films and other sort of, I can see some of the influences at the time. One, of course, Cannibal Holocaust, right? The sort of whole thing of the found footage, cinema verite approach to the film itself being a record of these people's adventures, or their misadventures, I should say, going on an excursion and disappearing. It also reminded me of Carl Edward Wagner's story Styx, which I think is a fabulous short story. And things like The House in the Woods, things like there being supernatural forces in the woods, altering time, altering space, but especially in the wood twig fetishes that you see, in the Blair Witch Project. That's also a big part of Styx as well. And also, I think that there was also some real legends of a witch in Maryland. I'm trying to think of her name. Mal Dyer, maybe Mal Dyer. So there were some of sort of these things around at the time. But I think the filmmakers did a great job of pulling these disparate elements together and really making something that had a great verisimilitude. It looked really real. You really believed that these people were real people out looking for these things. And it was a great movie. I enjoyed it a lot. Wasn't crazy about the sequel, but I did like the new sort of, I don't know if it's a reboot, sequel, retake on it that just recently came out.
So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed my friend's takes on this movie. Now, I just want to give a little shout out to 3 different reviews of this film that I think if you're a fan of this movie, you might really want to check out these 3 reviews of the film. Now, there's this guy here on YouTube called Rambo Wrath for Life, and I've been watching this guy's videos for years. Honestly, he's one of the people who really influenced me to start doing videos on YouTube, but he actually did an hour-long review of this film, which I'll put a link to in the description, so definitely check out that guy's review. If you're a fan of this film, I think you might really enjoy that review that this guy, Rambo Wrath for Life, did. There's also this guy named Cecil who has a website and a YouTube channel called GoodBadFlicks, and he did a review on this film, which was actually a really, really well done review, which I'll also put the link to in the description below. I also listened to this podcast called The Faculty of Horror, which I mentioned before in my Inferno review, but they did a really well done episode on this movie, so I'll put a link in the description below to where you can listen to that episode of The Faculty of Horror. But once again, definitely check out these 3 reviews of the film if you're a fan of this movie. I think you'll definitely like these people's takes on this film. Now, when this movie came out, it quickly became a pop culture phenomenon. As I said earlier in this review, this was probably the most talked about film of 1999. And even though this wasn't the first found footage film, the found footage genre would not be what it is today if it wasn't for this movie. The movie also inspired a ridiculous number of spoofs and parodies. There was also a series of young adult novels which picked up where the movie left off. Also, shortly after this, there was a TV series called Freaky Links, which I think was actually made by some of the same people who made this movie, and that show was originally developed as a Blair Witch TV series, but soon developed into its own thing. The movie also spawned 2 sequels, one in 2000 called Book of Shadows, Blair Witch 2, and then one in 2016 called Blair Witch. Now, after this movie, Heather Donahue, the actor Heather Donahue, not the character, of course, but the actress Heather Donahue, she acted in a few things after this, but eventually she gave up acting and ended up making a career growing medical marijuana, and she ended up writing a book called Grow Girl, How My Life After the Blair Witch Project Went to Pot. So yeah, that was my review on the Blair Witch Project, and my next movie review will be Book of Shadows, Blair Witch 2.
Mom, I'm scared. If you see this, I'm probably dead.